Utilitarianism is a moral philosophy that looks at the consequences of actions to determine their rightness or wrongness. It's been used to justify numerous policies and numerous philosophical positions over the ages.
In this short video, I'd like to look at another major school of moral reasoning, one which I think really, if you unpick most discussions about morality in the contemporary world, it's lurking underneath it in a number of surprising places. The school of thought is utilitarianism. That is to say, something is right or wrong according to the utility it brings, the overall happiness. So consequently, unlike deontology, which is relentless at looking at the motivations of actions to decide whether or not something is right, what utilitarians look at is the consequences. What happiness has it brought? And if something brings overall happiness, it can be regarded as being a good thing. Or if it brings overall unhappiness or sadness, if you will, it is not a moral act. So therefore, morality is determined by the happiness it brings and the consequences of an act rather than its motivations.
Perhaps the founding father of utilitarianism is this chap here, Jeremy Bentham. This is Jeremy Bentham. His mummified body is kept at University College London, and this is it. In his work, The Introduction to the Principles of Morals and Legislation, Jeremy Bentham writes the following. This is in chapter 1. Nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. It is for them alone to point out what we ought to do, as well as to determine what we shall do. On the one hand, the standard of right and wrong, on the other, the chain of causes and effects are fastened to their throne. They govern us in all we do, in all we say, in all we think. So let's just repeat that line, the standard of right and wrong. You know, what Bentham is saying here is that in our lives, certain things bring us pleasure, certain things bring us pain. We want to maximize the thing that brings us pleasure and minimize the things which bring us pain. And this is the nub of Bentham's moral philosophy. If government, if we as a society, if we as individuals manage to get to a situation in which things which bring us happiness are instituted, then that's morally right. On the other hand, if lots of pain is brought about by something, then that's morally wrong. You know, for utilitarianism, this is the principle of life, bringing about as much happiness. Now, there's issues here. What happens if something brings unhappiness to a very small group of people and happiness to a large group of people? Well, Bentham seems to think that that would be okay, but he's not the only voice in utilitarianism on this issue, because others think differently.
One of the major distinctions in utilitarianism is act versus rule utilitarians. Now, act utilitarians kind of think that we as individuals need to, when making moral decisions, calculate what is going to bring the most happiness, the maximum happiness. Those people who are rule utilitarians take that kind of decision making out of our hands somewhat. They think rather than us making decisions, if we apply certain rules as a society, then we will be happier. Now, a classic example of this, and now John Stuart Mill is not unproblematically a rule utilitarian, but a classic example is the liberty principle from On Liberty, which I'll go on and look at in some depth now.
Now, Mill's harm principle is the following, and I apologise for the long quotes here. That principle is that the sole end for which mankind are warranted, individually or collectively, in interfering with the liberty of action of any of their number is self-protection. That the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of the civilised community against its will is to prevent harm to others, and so on and so forth. Now, our purpose here is not so much to look at the nature of the harm principle into what it was allowed, but what Mill is saying here is we should have complete freedom. That the only reason someone has to stop you, me, anyone else from doing precisely what they want to do is if that act is physically harming someone else. If we don't like it, if it brings us unhappiness, more on this on a second, or even if we're offended by it, that's not sufficient reason to stop it. Now, this sounds an awful lot like rights, doesn't it? But utilitarians don't like the language of moral rights. They would just simply ask, well, where does it come from? Who gives us it? Upon what basis are we talking of rights? Rather, what Mill is arguing here is that if we apply this rule, we are overall happier as a society. True enough, Mill thinks that someone might do something that offends us, that we might not like, that makes us unhappy. And you might think, well, you know, if we are applying utilitarianism here, surely that kind of act would be disallowed. Not at all, Mill says. Overall, as a society, applying the rule of the liberty principle, we are happier to live in freedom than we are unhappy by other people's acts of freedom.
So for utilitarians, bringing about the maximum amount of happiness in society is the chief end. Now, we're going to see across this module that precisely how this has been applied is massively diverse. You know, for example, Bentham famously says, pushpin is as good as poetry. It doesn't matter what brings you pleasure so long as you get lots of it. And we shouldn't make any distinguishing categories between higher pleasures and lower pleasures, whereas John Stuart Mill thinks the exact opposite. It's better to be an unsatisfied Socrates than a satisfied pig. And he thinks that intellectual pleasures are greater. Also, you know, we'll look at something called descending marginal utility. And that sometimes, you know, let's look at this example. Suppose it would bring everybody a lot of pleasure to see me at the front of the lecture theatre being whipped. That might bring me an awful lot of pain, and I might not like it. But if the overall pleasure to everybody else is greater than my pain, well, surely that would be right. Now, proponents of descending marginal utility will say, well, this is nonsense, because for some people, a certain act will bring a great amount of pain and only a small amount of pleasure. Peter Singer, the Australian philosopher, for example, is going to use this as a utilitarian argument for vegetarianism. The pleasure that you get from a chicken sandwich is not nearly as great as the chicken has in living. So consequently, we should not eat meat. So utilitarianism, although it sounds on the basis of it to be relatively simple, that we should maximize the amount of happiness in society, that masks a hidden complexity to it as a moral ideology, and we will follow that across in this module.